Hi guys, I'm Darren, and in this video we're going to be finishing off our beginner's line of sight plane build using ETHOS. So in the last video we got our model set up on the transmitter, we bound our receiver, we got everything installed inside the plane, and we were basically at the point where we want to start checking over things to make sure that everything is set up right. So that's what we're going to be looking at in this video. You may notice on the desk that behind me isn't an S-back at the minute. That's because I figure it would be easier to show you just by having a wing, which I can get to the camera easier so you can see in more detail. So that's what I'll be using for the first part, but I will be showing the ESC calibration, which will be in the plane that you can see just up there. So we will be getting that plane down and finishing the final part of the setup on that. So what we're going to do first is actually nothing to do with this on the desk. We're going to have a look at the manual for the S-back, because there's actually information in most manuals that you need and is pretty important for getting the plane set up properly. But what we're going to do is take a look at the Dynam manual for this particular model. Of course, I said in the first video, this is not the type of model you want to be flying as. You want a trainer, something like that. But this was the best model for me to actually get on the desk and demonstrate with. So that's why I'm using this model. But let's head into the manual. Okay, so I'm just going to sort of skim through this at the minute. A lot of the information for what we're setting up we don't need, but of course I'd well recommend that you do read through the manual, and chances are you would have to sort of put it together anyway. There's a few bits of information here. The most useful is the type of battery that we need in this plane. In most of your sort of beginner trainer planes, you'll probably find that that's a 2200 milliamp hour 3S pack. They're used quite extensively in sort of 1.3, 1.4 meter size planes. So that's generally what you'll probably be flying with. But what we're going to do is go further down the manual. If you've never flown a plane before, reading this guide about what the transmitter does to the control surfaces is useful. But if you're at that level, 100% join a club and get your experience with them. So now we get to the first important part, and that is the CG. Now the CG is the center of gravity, and this is the point that we want to balance the plane at so we get a nice controllable aircraft. If you go too far forward, you'll find that it gets sort of quite sluggish, and if you go too far backwards, you can actually have a plane that will be really uncontrollable and you have to try really hard not to crash it. What I would recommend is, if like this you get a range on the CG, when you first set it up, go to the front of that CG. That should be a bit more controllable, and then when you get more confident you can move the CG back, which will give you a much more sort of aerobatic plane. But then if you go back from that, you'll find that it starts to get uncontrollable. So most manufacturers will actually test the planes, get a nice region. The front measurement will be great for beginners. The back measurement will be more for experienced pilots who want to throw the plane about a bit more. So what you'd be doing on your beginner plane is aiming for that 75 millimeters. Of course, in your plane's manual, you have completely different measurements, but this is just a demo. So the next important part that we have is the suggested control surface throws. Now, this is very important. This is how much the control surfaces move and deflect the air to turn the aircraft. So what you can see here is we have again a range. So starting at 12 millimeters to 15 millimeters for the elevator, 15 millimeters to 20 millimeters for the aileron, and 12 millimeters to 15 millimeters for the rudder. So they're the numbers that you want to work for. And what I'll be explaining later on in this video is rates. What that basically means is on a switch, we can have low rates, mid rates and high rates. The low rates will be the least movement, so you'd aim for about 12 millimeters, and the high rates will be that 15 millimeters. Of course, once you get used to the plane and you fly it a lot, you might decide that actually the 15 isn't enough and you can increase that. Or you might find even that the 12 millimeters is too much and you want to just decrease it a little bit. So what we'll be doing is aiming for our aileron here at 15 millimeters with low rates and 20 millimeters with high rates, and about the middle for the mid rates. So they're the main parts of this manual that are useful to us. In some manuals, they even include recommended expo as well, when I explain the expo settings in a minute, you'll understand what they are. If you don't have expo settings in the manual, for a regular plane, I would just start at around 35%. You might find that it's a bit too much or a bit too little, but 35 for a beginner trainer plane is a good number. You may even want to go down to about 30. But I'll explain what expo is in a minute. And also I'll show you how you can have different expo values for different rates. Though with the beginner planes, you really don't need it. You just need the one. This is for as we progress into more acrobatic planes with much bigger throws. We might want more expo with those higher throws. So what I'm going to do now is get this model set up and we'll have a look at some of these features. Okay, so this is our wing, and I just thought before I went any further, I would show you what we need to adjust for adjusting the throws. So what you have is the servo, we have a control rod, and then we have our control horn. Of course, on the servo, we have a servo horn. Basically, the different distances out from the middle of the servo and away from the control horn will actually give us more or less throw. So if we look down the wing, you can see this easier. So on the servo horn, we have about 5 holes here. And you can see actually on this, I've got my control rod in the outermost hole. Then we have our control rod itself, followed by a clevis at this end. And then we have a control horn, which this has 4 holes in it. To adjust how much the control surface moves, we just need to move this or this end into the right hole. Now if you want even throws, so up and down moves the same, you ideally want to change the control horn so that you have 90 degrees between the control rod and the line that you see with the center of those dots. So at the moment this is slightly off. You'd want it so that it was about there to get you at 90 degrees. It's not 90 degrees to the servo body, it is 90 degrees from the line you can see from the dots to the line of the control rod, and that will get even throws on both sides. But you'll find that it's a little bit of sort of messing about. You need to get the length right for the throws first of all, and then you need to move the control rod, which then you might need to adjust that again. But as far as throws go, there's basically an opposing rule for each end. So with the servo end, the closer this rod is to the servo, the less throw you have, but you also get more torque because of that. So it can push harder. So the lower this is towards the servo, the less throw and the more torque. The further away from the outside, the more throw you have and the less torque. So this is set up for more throw at this point. With this end, the opposite is true. So the further away from the control surface you are, the less throw you have. The closer to the middle of the control surface, the more throw you have. So what I'll do is I'll just demonstrate that. So at the moment, we're on the outermost hole here. So that is the most throw. And we're on the innermost hole here. So what I'll do is I'll just stick it here where we can see it. And I'll move the servo all the way. So you can see at this point here, we have a gap. Now this is where you would actually measure the throw from. So you'd want to come from the one flat edge, and if this is a point, that's much easier if they're both proper points. But where most foam models, it has a flat trailing edge. You want to come from like the bottom or the top, and then match it up to the same edge on the control surface. So you can use a ruler for this. So I'm going to put that against the bottom edge. And if I look at the bottom edge on the control surface, you can see that that is about 22 millimeters. So with that set up, the throw here is about 22 millimeters. So what I'm going to do, sorry about it going out of focus, I'm just going to pop this off. All right, so there we go. You can see with the servo in the same position, I don't even really need to measure it. You can see that the gap is huge, but there we go. So we are looking at from the bottom edge, we're looking about 44 millimeters. So you can see by moving this how you adjust the throw. So let me put that back in the top because that is actually pretty close to our 20mm. What you of course need to do is when you adjust this, it does change the center position. So if I plug in my servo, so I'll just plug it into the receiver and give it some power.
Telemetry recovered.
Right, so you can see the movement we have here. So our control surface is now centered on the servo. If we move the bar, it will actually move where the center is. So we will need to adjust it to get the center correct. That actually still looks like too much throw. So, right, so this might be a bit easier with hands free. So let me move that all the way over to the side and we can see what throw we have here. So yeah, we're at 30mm. So I am going to have to take this out and reduce it. Right, so by the rules, we know that this here, we're at the top, so that is the minimum throw that we can have, so we need to move this end down. All right, so I'm not going to be able to get in there, so I won't be able to do the 90 degrees. This is already glued in, it's quite deep, and I can't get to the screw, but I will be able to open the hole up slightly so that we can reduce the throws. So you might be able to see it, but those holes there are a bit smaller than the one that the bar is going through. If I take the bar out, you can see the difference in size. So what I'm going to do is go down to about the number 3 and I'll open that up and then we'll get back to the video. Okay, so you can see here that I've opened up the third hole down and put our rod through it. So let's have a look and see what the throw is like now. And that will actually do, that's pretty much 20mm. So I am using the ruler here. So you can see that bottom to bottom is basically 19.5mm, so that will do. Yeah, you can do this with a ruler, but you can also get something called a throw gauge, which you basically put on the wing. So it's going to be difficult for you to see at this angle, so let me tilt it like that. And you line up the center point to the control surface, move it, and then you get a nice easy reading. Unfortunately, these are really made for bigger aircraft, so for smaller things they're a bit awkward. It's a shame that there's not like a smaller version of this, but it works much easier than a ruler because you don't have to hold everything. But we're going to call that our 20mm for our full throws. Of course, if we were doing the rudder or the elevator, we'd need to be looking at 15mm. But now what we need to do is just make sure that the control surface is level. Unfortunately, this is not a great servo and there's quite a bit of play in that. That is actually not brilliant. But I'm going to show you how to adjust it so that you get that nice and flush. So the first thing to do is obviously make sure that you've got the servo powered on and the control surface centered, trim centered. That's quite an important part. You want the trim to be center. And what we're going to do is if we look at it, we want to move that way probably 0.5 millimeter, maybe 1 millimeter, not a lot. So what we need to do is undo this clevis. Maybe half a turn will do it. So let me unclip this again. And on this one, it's actually got a grub screw on it. A lot of them don't have grub screws. They usually just can turn, or you might have something like a ball joint. But yeah, so let's undo the grub screw. I'm going to go half a turn and then we'll put it back in and test it. And there you go, that is bang on where we want to be. So you just want to make sure that you have these control surfaces nice and flush before you do your maiden flight. But obviously do that after you've got the correct amount of throws, because if you change the throws, it will adjust the alignment here. And of course, do that on your elevator and your rudder. Right, so the last thing that we're going to look at on this is if you're using a plastic clevis, this little plastic bit of tube here is brilliant. Now, Most of them don't come with this, or a lot of them don't come with this. This is just a bit of 6mm aquarium airline tube. You can also use nitro fuel tube if you're flying a nitro, and you just slide that on, lock the clevis, and then slide it up, and that will actually stop it coming undone. But there we go, we have our completed aileron. That's actually not too bad for the 90° either now. If you follow that line central of the holes, it's a little bit over, but it's not bad. Right, so of course you would repeat this with both the elevator and rudder using their correct amount of throws, but once we've got all our throws done and all our control surfaces correctly aligned, then we can get on to looking at rates and expo. Okay, so we have our transmitter. I've sort of taped and balanced the wing again so we can see what's going on. On camera that does actually look a lot more throw than it is. That is about the 20mm that we want. If I put the ruler up there, you'll see that that's pretty damn close. Right, so the first thing that we're going to talk about is rates. So what rates does, as I mentioned earlier, is control how much throw we have. So what we've set is the highest amount of throw that we want on the control surface, and that will be our high rates. So what we can also do is set up some low rates. So we go into our mixer, and what we're going to do is we'll go to ailerons, because that's what we have here. And if you scroll down, you'll see there's this section here called weight/rates, and this is what we want to adjust. So the first bit we don't touch, that's 100%, that is our full movement. But what we want to do is add a new weight. And the first thing that we do is select a switch. So I personally use this switch here on the top as my rate switch. So I'm going to put that all the way towards me, which will be my low rates. So there we go, SE with a down arrow. For me, that is where I like my low rates. So we can press return to get out of that. And now what we're going to do is reduce the weight here until we get to that 15mm for the aileron. So if I put that there, see, need to reduce it a little bit more. Let's try 70%. Bit more. I'm just going down in 10% blocks at the minute. You could always fine tune it. But there we go, 60% is good enough for me. That's 15mm, which also is nice and handy because now we can add some mid rates. So because I'm OCD, I will probably swap these two around, but for the time being, let's just set the switch in the middle position for the mid rates. And what we'll do is we'll drop that to 80 because it's in between 60 and 100. So what we now have is the switch all the way back. We have our full rates. So we go there, that's full rates. Middle is mid rates. And then all the way down is low rates. Now mid rates don't actually look that much different. So of course, when the servo moves, it might not be linear due to the angles and everything involved. So what you could do, you could actually get that set to 17. So it only needs to come down a little bit more. Let's try 75. There we go, about 17.5mm. Let's go 70 just to. So now we'll have our visible full rates. So full rates, mid rates, and low rates. And you can see it's about even. And that's what we want to set up for our control surface. So you'd obviously do this for your elevator and rudder, again referring to the manual for what the low rates and high rates are, and then the mid rates, just get it in the middle. That's rate sorted. So what we can also talk about now is what I mentioned earlier is expo. Now I did demo this in the other video, but what I'll do is show again as an example. So to set expo, we just want to go to this curve section at the pretty much the top of the mixer. And we're going to change that to expo. At the moment we have no expo, so the movement of the servo is basically linear with the stick movement. But what expo is actually for is to soften the middle of the stick. So if you've got really big throws, you'll find that that little bit of movement in the middle is too much. And you can see that where it's a linear control, there's quite a lot of movement for a little amount of movement on the gimbal. So what expo does is allow you to have a bit less movement of the control surface with small movements in the middle. So to demonstrate that, I'm going to set this stupid high. So we'll go 80%, which you might find on like 3D models, the models with sort of barn door control surfaces, but it's really good for demonstrating. So I'm going to move it that little bit in the middle. And you can see for about the same amount of movement, the actual control surface is not moving at all, but then it progressively gets more movement towards the outside edge of the gimbal movement. As I mentioned in the intro, for a sort of basic regular trainer plane, you only really want about 30 to 35% expo. That should be plenty. So if I show you with 35, you'll see that in the middle we still get little movement, and then as we progress to the outside you get more. But you'll find that if you move it in the middle, it's not going to overreact too much. The problem you'll probably find when you're first getting started is you try to bash the sticks over and you try to over control it. Just get used to that little bit of control in the middle, and then once you get used to it, lower that down to about 30. And that's a pretty good number for average planes, is 30. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, I'm going to show you now how to add different amounts of expo for different throws, which again, this is coming for more a highly acrobatic plane, 3D plane, that sort of thing, where we could, for example, have 80% expo on the first setting. And then what we'll do is add a new curve. We would set the switch to the same switch as our rates, set the curve to expo, and then just add another amount in here. So let's say 60% for the mid rates, and then we'll add another curve for our low rates, and again make that expo, and we'll set that to the 30%. And what you can do is, again, you can tune the expo. So what you ideally want it is when it's maybe about half stick, it doesn't really move much. You can see actually the top two are pretty good. So that could possibly go up maybe. So that there is pretty decent. So in the middle, you're not actually moving much at all. So the middle part of the stick all will react the same. It's only when you get to the outside that you get the more throws. But again, for your beginner plane, just set it at 35% and that should all be good. Alright, so at this point in the video, we understand what CG is. We know where we want to get the plane to balance. We've set up the amount of throw on our control surfaces. We've also centered our control surfaces so they're nice and flush with the surrounding sort of body parts around them. We've added rates so that we have our high and low throws and a mid throw, and also we've looked at our expo so we get that nice smooth middle part of the stick, so we get a bit more control in the middle. So next what I'm going to do is swap this bit for the plane and we'll calibrate the ESC. Right, so as I mentioned in the last video, if we're doing anything really with plugging a battery in, we want to take the propeller off. So make sure that your propeller's off. Right, so let's calibrate our ESC. So first of all, make sure your battery's unplugged. I have a switch on mine just to make it easier for the demo. This is in the off position, so there's no power getting to anything. So if you've got a throttle cut, you want to turn off the throttle cut. We're going to raise the throttle all the way up, and then we're going to add power. What you'll hear from the ESC is a series of beeps. When they stop, we're going to lower the throttle, and then we'll get the regular sort of power on beeps that you'll get from the ESC. When that happens, the ESC is calibrated so it knows where the low and high throttle points are. So let's go.
Telemetry recovered.
There we go, that's it done. So now our motor knows exactly where off is and full throttle is.
Disarmed.
That's the ESC calibrated, nice and simple. So the next thing that you want to check is to make sure that the motor is spinning the correct direction. Now what I'll do is I'll move the plane backwards a little bit. Okay, so for this, what I'm going to do is just rest the prop on and I'm going to gently put the nut on. I'm going to make sure that there's nothing really attached. Now this is obviously going to spin, so be careful with this. But we want it so that the prop is loose, so that if it does snag on anything, it's not really going to do much damage. But we're going to just use low throttle anyway. So let's arm the plane,
Armed.
and we'll raise the throttle very gradually until the motor starts spinning. And then we can shut it off. The prop was spinning, so we're all good. Right, so we know that that was spinning clockwise when viewed from the back, which is the correct way round. So let's disarm. So you can see on the prop that this is exactly as it's come off the plane. On the front, you'll see the prop size and numbers. So we have 10 or 13 by 6, and then the size in millimeters. Those numbers always face the direction of the plane when it's flying forwards. So they always face the front. And what you have here is the leading edge of a prop. And then on the other side, you have the trailing edge. So the leading edge is a lot thicker at this point, where the trailing edge is a lot thinner. And obviously the numbers are pointing forward, so you know that that's the lead. So the idea is when the prop goes through the air, it pushes it backwards. So if we put my finger here, as I turn the prop, it's going to push it towards the back. So the prop needs to be spinning clockwise, well, when viewed from the back in this example. So that is actually spinning the correct direction. If you find that the propeller is spinning the opposite way, or backwards, this is an ESC. Obviously the one for this model is buried in here. So if I needed to change this, I'd have needed to take the cowl off. But let's grab another motor, and I'm just going to connect it up. So I'll put white to white, that to there, and that to there. Right, so if this motor was actually spinning backwards, to reverse it, all we need to do is swap any two of these three wires. So if I swap this one that's on the red with the one that's on the black, that would now be spinning the opposite direction, so the propeller would be working correctly. So that's all you need to do if your propeller isn't spinning in the right direction. Okay, so the final thing to do is get the CG set. So this is an old 2200 4S that I've got. So we'll slide that in the nose, and then we'll stick the canopy on. So that's 75 millimeters in on the bottom. You want to put some marks, or even better, put some little pins, like the type you get for sort of map or pin boards, the quite short ones. They're ideal because you can feel where they are nice and easily, and they actually make a nice surface to balance on. So reach under the plane, find those two little pins on your 75 millimeters back in this example, and then lift the plane. That's a little bit too far backwards, so let's move the CG forwards a bit, or the weight forwards. That's still a bit tail heavy, so that's all the way forwards now. Let's see if that works. And there we go, that's nicely balancing. And that's what you want to aim for, a nice neutral balance on that CG mark, everything on the plane, battery inserted. What you can do is make a note of where the rear of that battery is, so it's easier for you to get it in and out in the future. Once that CG is in the right place, then you're good to fly. Right, so before we wrap up, I'd just like to please ask you, if you did find this video useful, to give it a thumbs up, click the subscribe button and the bell icon. That will help get this video out to more people so they can learn how to set this up too. But just to go over what we've done in this video, we've learnt what CG is, why it's important to set up, and how to set it up. So we get our plane nice and balanced. We've set the throws on our control surfaces and made sure that the control surfaces are nice and flush with the adjacent parts of the plane. We've set rates to get the minimum and maximum throws recommended in the manual, plus a mid rates in between those two. We've added expo, which will give us a softer center to the gimbal, and we've also calibrated the ESC and understood how to reverse the motor if it's running backwards. So at this point, we're basically ready for our maiden flight. We want to go over the plane one final time just to make sure that everything is buttoned up, tightened up, got Loctite on where it needs it, nothing's going to fall off, it's all glued properly. Then we can go to the flying field, and again, I can't stress this enough, I'd recommend going to a club, getting an experienced pilot to just check the plane over, even take it up for the first time, especially if you are new to this hobby. They will get it trimmed out, and then you can buddy box with them and learn to fly and enjoy this fantastic hobby. If there's anything in this video that you'd like me to cover in more detail or go over, then please leave a comment and I'll see what I can do. But until then, thank you very much for watching, guys. Have a great time.